So in thinking about the history of liberalism, I try to think exactly about the ways in which community has always been the real foundation of the liberal project. It's in a very simple and straightforward way, you know, that one of the things that historians of the Enlightenment have pointed out again and again is the Enlightenment was really made not in salons or on paper by the great philosophes. It was made in the coffee houses of Paris. That's where the essential conversations, even more important, the habit of conversation, the idea of sitting down in a room with people with whom you shared no genes, no blood relation, very often not even a religious affiliation, and beginning the process of conversation. That's the atom, that's the germ of the Enlightenment project. This was something that one of my greatest liberal heroes, Frederick Law Olmsted, the inventor and designer of Central Park, emphasized. Olmsted is another one of those extraordinary liberal figures who not enough people know enough about. We know him as the maker, designer of Central Park, but what people tend to forget is the underpinning, just as we forget the underpinning of Smith's free market in his apprehension of the power of social sympathy, we forget that before Olmsted designed a square inch of park in the middle of this city, he was a reporter for the New York Times, one of the first reporters for the New York Times, and he went south to the slave states and he wrote a book about them. And he asked himself a very profound question. He said, why is it that culture in the South, though they think of themselves as having a leisure culture that the North does not have, why is it so stultified? Why is it so stereotyped? Why is it so limited? And he said it's because the existence of the institution of slavery prevents what we would now call intermediate institutions, social capital, from developing. But Olmsted had a much more beautiful name for it. He called it commonplace civilization. He said in a plantation slave society, it's very hard to generate commonplace civilization where people come together and in unaffiliated ways to do specific things. And he has a beautiful hymn to the power in the North of fireworks associations, volunteer firemen groups, glee clubs, baseball teams, all of the ways in which people become accustomed to dealing with people who are fundamentally unlike themselves, and in the ways in which that commonplace civilization becomes the basis for democracy. And that, as we do not teach our children sufficiently, is the ideology, is the philosophy that underlies Central Park. The idea of making a park for the people, which does not have a predetermined set of activities in it, but leaves itself open to be reinvented generation after generation in terms of the commonplace civilization of each time and of each new people. And just in case you think that this sounds like well-meaning bomb fog coming from me, I'm sure all of you in this room knows that that's an insight that was original to Olmsted, was later made historical by the great German sociologist Jürgen Habermas, that's been validated again and again in the works particularly of Robert Putnam, the great Harvard sociologist, when Putnam went off to find out what made democracy work in Italy. Where did democracy work well? Where did it work poorly? The answer was always, if pre-existing commonplace civilization was in place, if people had the habit of working with, belonging to organizations that did not simply include fellow clan members, then democracy, local democracy would work. If you didn't have that pre-existing habit of working in civil means for whatever cause, for nothing more than putting on an amateur production of Rigoletto, if you didn't have those intermediate institutions, if you didn't have that social capital of commonplace civilization, then democracy would not take. And I hardly need to say in this room how much that insight explains a great deal of much of what has happened since the end of the Cold War and the difficulties and possibilities of importing democracy, watching democracy grow elsewhere. So that was the first core thing I wanted to do, was to emphasize the origins of liberalism, not in a narrow Robinson Crusoe style individualism, but instead in ideas about community and ideas about connection. I say in the book that social contacts always precede the social contract. Olivia said, that's a good soundbite, Dad. So I will repeat it again. And I think it's true. The other theme of the book is about how the heroism of compromise, about how it is that what the word that we think of as being a weak or secondary word, compromise, conciliation, are in fact fighting words, because they don't represent our surrender of our passions and our principles. unnecessarily. They simply represent our capacity to recognize that we are not the only ones with passions and principles, that we live in a pluralistic society in which the limits of my passions are the limits of my own skin and eyes, and that if we are to make change happen, we can only make it happen through a recognition that other people have passions and principles as great as our own. Compromise and conciliation, far from seeming secondary or weak words, should be seen always as fighting and inspiring words. I am a Canadian. Canada is built on a series of inspired compromises amongst very, very different peoples, and yet continues to act as what is in many ways a model liberal nation. So those two principles, the principle of community and the principle of compromise, seen as essential to the liberal project and seen as essential to our ongoing existence, are the core of my book.